the reason why we first opened 125 years ago was to look after Dove Cottage and to also make sure that it was accessible to the public, but then also to promote Romanticism and the Wordsworth and his circle and his literature to people today. And although that was sort of written 125 years ago, I think it's still really relevant, because I think in this day and age, especially when we're living in a time where there's been obviously big economic crisis, there's big global terrorism going on, politically we've had a lot of change, and it's very easy to sort of dismiss arts and culture and heritage and think actually that's not really a priority. We should be looking, especially when people are sort of using food banks and living on benefits and their housing's not secure, or they're in private rented accommodation that's not like properly fit for purpose. So there's so many things in Britain that you think, like why should I give my money to Dove Cottage, or why is it important? But I think that's exactly what makes us a free and interesting, diverse and civilised sort of society. And
Well, I think poetry itself is important. Just this morning watching the news, actually, it was just so horrific watching yet another terrorist attack. And there was an interesting guy on who was actually saying that people shouldn't be sharing these images and on social media, because actually this is really succeeding, making them succeed, because it's creating fear. And what's coming out of it is the artwork that people are actually posting, which is sympathetic and supportive, and it's creative. And I think in the same way, poetry has a role, because it's so important that we engage with nature. The whole arts is being underfunded in this country now. So I think places like the Wordsworth Trust, so okay, you've got the romantic poets who you could say potentially, what have they got to do with my life if you're 18 and you live in an inner city area? But actually I find on the tours that they're often some of the people who really engage with the poetry, and because it is a response to nature and it is about being in harmony with things and looking at things and appreciating things. And I think that is a really important thing, that we have that contrast in such a technical world with all this harsh, hard news coming in. We need a balance, don't we?
No, it helps us like understand nature and understand the self, and particularly living in like city environments and stuff, we do need to sort of like appreciate natural beauty. And I think it's just human to sort of question who you are and what you do, and poetry is sort of a great medium to access that. As well, I've noticed in romantic poetry that it's written at a time of like political change and stuff like that, such as like the French Revolution happening, and with all like the political like change we have at the minute, like Britain, we've just left the EU, for example. I think like romantic poetry such as Wordsworth does help us sort of understand such a like turbulent times we're going through.
Literature just speaks very directly to people, whatever time really. What I love about it, I suppose, is that people are having conversations with themselves about what it means to be alive, what it means to be human, what it means to belong in society, what it means to be outside society. I think the Romantics, Wordsworth, Coleridge and the others, were so much involved in looking at those issues, which are just as important for all of us today. And I was thinking earlier about a sonnet that Wordsworth wrote about seeing a Negro woman on the ferry coming across from Calais, and that she'd been driven out of France. And this was back in 1802, at a point when Wordsworth was struggling with his political radicalism. He'd been very much in favour of the French Revolution. and was now becoming very disenchanted because of the violence and the brutality and the prejudice that he could see. And in just that one short poem, he seems to sum up a whole personality, even though the woman herself has very little to say directly. He gives her a life in the poem.
Well, I think there are so many similarities in society and in the political situation that we have in this country. Wordsworth lived in a society which was watched by the government. There was a lot of surveillance going on, even to the extent that he was suspected of being a French spy, and the government sent somebody to spy on him specifically. I suppose in some ways they probably weren't wrong, because he did sympathise with the revolution. We were fighting a mysterious enemy, an evil enemy abroad, which was invisible to people in this country, and was portrayed as something extremely sinister. And in that way I think society was manipulated, and Wordsworth spoke out against it. Not that vociferously in his lifetime, I guess. It's always said that if the Prelude had been published when he was alive, he would have been arrested for seditious libel. So fortunately it wasn't until after he was dead. And the messages that he has are still relevant today. These sort of things are timeless. The relationship between man and the landscape and society and nature. These things just don't change. And the messages are the same, and I think people are still expressing the same things now, but in a different way. And the reason it's important this century is that I think people try and find an easy way of saying things, and that results in platitudes, as opposed to, which people see as solutions, as opposed to arguments which you have to think about and you have to work to get the meaning from.
I think for me, what's so important about romantic literature is that it's still so accessible today. So even though a lot of it was written over 200 years ago, we can all read it now and get something from it. And it was really important to Wordsworth in particular to write in the language of the common man, or the everyday person. And I think that the language that he uses is still very readable and accessible today. And so everybody can enjoy the themes of romanticism, whether it's nature or people who are perhaps a bit sort of separate from mainstream society, or people who just like beautiful use of language, and they can all appreciate that now, even today.
Wordsworth is really important within today's society, especially within education, because he wanted poetry to become accessible to everyone. So he wanted the everyday person, their voices to be heard, and also for them to be kind of inspired to write poetry. It's also really important, especially within the Lake District, because Wordsworth encouraged so many people to come and visit here, with it being such a stunning, beautiful spot, and so picturesque. And I think it's definitely encouraged people to want to come here and write and, make art. We get lots of visitors here that go away wanting to kind of be creative in some way or another, and that to me is really important, and you can see why that was important to him as well.
The reason that I work at the Wordsworth Trust, and that Wordsworth's work particularly, but also some of the other Romantic poets' work is important, is because of the connection with nature, and Wordsworth's talking about Mother Nature being a teacher. And certainly today we recognise that ecology and environment are really important, and I think Wordsworth was really before his time on that, sort of saying that the Lake District should be a sort of national property. He said that over 100 years before we got the national park, and his appreciation for all the small things, and the same for Dorothy's appreciation for all of those sort of small animals and insects and flowers, and the way that he looks and writes about them is really beautiful. And I think that that's just as easy to appreciate today than perhaps it was in his time. And certainly also the importance of writing from one's own personal experience was something that I think the Romantics, you know, can take a lot of credit for, something that we do naturally today, certainly when I'm working with kids, and we're always encouraging them to write from personal experience and then throw a colouring of imagination on it. And I think that, you know, without the Romantics we wouldn't have a lot of the great poetry, the contemporary poetry that we have today.
Well, I think that Romantic literature and the whole Romantic movement was really the start of a new modern sensibility that we're still really engaging with now. I think you can see a connection between that sort of inward lookingness and the consideration of the individual. I think people have been seen as types before that, you know, connected with their status, their job perhaps, and this is really opening up a whole new world, that each person is an individual and a unique person who has new and different and interesting thoughts, whether it be somebody of a very low status. Again, Wordsworth's quite new in considering people who are quite low status as having thoughts and emotions and lives that are equally as important as anyone else's. So I think that whole idea that each person has a different reflection on the world, has dignity and deserves respect as an individual is something that hopefully we're still taking into consideration today.
Romantic literature is important, I think, on a psychological level. I think it really asks you to be introspective, and that's why I love Romanticism. I love that it helps you get in touch with your inner thoughts and feelings, and it helps you to connect, of course, with your outside world, but more specifically, it really allows you this inner creativity of reflection and meditation that you just don't always get. And so why I've always loved Romanticism, why Romantic literature is important, is because it reminds us that we all have these little introspective moments throughout the day, that we all are thinking so many wild thoughts, making all these connections to what's around us, and I think it honors that, and it preserves that. So that's why I love Romantic literature.
Tempting answer to that question is to say that the Romantics were the first people to kind of explore the self, and we're living in an age of self and self-exploration and self-discovery, but actually I think that's a false lesson. I think the real reason it's important in the 21st century is because by understanding themselves, they were hoping to understand the rest of us better, and how we can interact with society, and how we can interact with our environment, and how we should do that respectfully and collectively, and make the world a better place together, rather than be kind of self-obsessed. And I think that's the lesson we should probably take from Romanticism.
Times, what comes across is that it was male poets actually talking about this, when there was also people like Dorothy Wordsworth who were documenting many of the day-to-day activities, and when you read those, they are much the same as the tasks and the things that people do today. And as you look at the landscape, many of those not challenges but things that come up, like gender equality and things, are very relevant today as they were back then. So it should be something that we should be able to keep top of the agenda and make sure that somebody does something about it.
Wordsworth and the Romantics can teach us so much about life and how we can live our lives and make the most of them, and how to engage with nature and members of our society and things. And I think also that their poetry was written at a time of great social turmoil and change and revolution, and in many ways it feels like our society is changing very rapidly and unexpectedly now, so perhaps if we look back to how they thought about it and what they did, it might help us work out what to do today.
And Wordsworth was kind of right in the middle of that, because he was very experimental as a poet, and he started things that are still going on in literature and in poetry, and as the poet, as someone who's a bit outside the system but is trying to speak in a voice that's accessible to ordinary people and cut through the pretense of normal life and of institutions and of traditions that have just kind of ossified and gone stale. So I think he kind of created that kind of move and started it off and inspired a lot of the other Romantic poets. Almost all of them owe some debt to Wordsworth.
Good question. Well, he I think his words resonate to this very day about the art, and in truth, the whole Romantic movement resonates through us to this day. I think we're all very much an echo of that past. The ideas of individuality, the celebrity, the vogue for the celebrity, the idea, the relationship between human beings and nature as well. I think all that resonates down from those the great Romantic writers as Wordsworth and Coleridge, and later poets as Keats and Shelley as well.
Romantic ideas are focusing on very small things, on very, there's beauty in everything. So I think it's important to get back to that idea and see that everything can be beautiful, and small little details, such like a daffodil. It's worth talking about and it's worth appreciating. It doesn't have to be grand and expensive. It can just be something cute and nice, like a daffodil.
It's important because it's a chance to kind of rethink things and look at the more beautiful side of things. So it's quite easy at the moment, especially to take things really seriously. So I think to kind of have that poetic approach to nature and to the environment around you kind of encourages you to stop and to look and to appreciate life a bit more.
Important, I think, Wordsworth's idea that we should live in harmony with nature and be part of nature is a very important idea, particularly now in the 20th century, and he seemed to be seeing into the future when he talked about how we should respect nature and learn from it. And I think that's a very important lesson for us now in the 21st century.
Things, at least for me, is his view on nature and on ecology, and he was sort of one of the first people to recognize the importance of preserving nature, and not just how beautiful it is, but also how delicate it is, and how humans actually have a lot of effect on it. So that's obviously become a much bigger deal. It's quite a big deal internationally today, and there are these global summits, where we're talking about the concepts that Wordsworth first laid out in his poetry. So I think it's a really good way for people to sort of go back to the roots of that, and it's not just about science and about global warming and all the facts. It's also about just the beauty of nature and how we really want to preserve that.
There's a lot of reference to the landscape, and the landscape has rarely changed. In fact, Wordsworth's contemporaries and people after him have done their best to preserve the landscape. So people can really refer the poetry to the landscape that we have today. If you take the poem Michael, for example, it mentions a sheepfold that's heart-shaped. And recently I was involved in an excavation, an archaeological excavation, which actually found a heart-shaped sheepfold in the very valley that he mentions it in Green Gill. So that is really good, and that's a mine that was there, and it was there in the Elizabethan times. So, and he refers to that, and that's the area that we were excavating. So I think it's got real provenance. People can relate to it, and people can relate to it from all over the world, because people all over the world learn English through the poetry of William Wordsworth.
I think it's important for the 21st century because it helps you appreciate nature, which is something which kind of transcends the centuries. His quote, "The world is too much with us late and soon," is something which still resonates today.
Writing about the landscape and the beauty of nature, I think in the 21st century, when we have all these technological developments and lots of things going on, I think it's nice to reflect on the simpler things and the beauty of nature that Wordsworth was so inspired by. So it's really important to take a break from sort of how hectic life can be and just enjoy the landscape and enjoy nature.
I think Wordsworth's literature in particular is so important because it is so relevant. I mean, the poetry that Wordsworth writes, he writes about subjects that we as human beings all experience, so things like love, loss, grief, the wonder of things around us. He writes poetry that everyone can relate to. One of my favourite lines of Wordsworth's poetry is, "In this moment there is life and food for future years."
This is the question that comes at the heart of our new project. This is the very essence of Wordsworth. How is his life of interest and influence to us today? How are the words that he wrote, the ideas behind them, of importance and relevance to today? How can, by reading a 200-year-old poet, who many people think of as worthy but dull, as I've been told, how can that be of use to us today? And I suppose I've seen the influence of Wordsworth, not so much from the top down, but from the bottom up. So if we're thinking of what is his value today, you see his value in the impact that these words can have on the many people who come through us at the Trust through our programmes. So these can be people of all ages and all backgrounds, and the poems seem to have an extra resonance when people read them from the original manuscripts and from the original books. And I suppose of the many aspects of Wordsworth as the poet of ecology, of nature, of the human condition, of community, all those three topics seem to be issues for today. And maybe they always have been issues for the day, whichever that day was. But I think if we're talking about things like the human condition, I can think of instances where people have read the poems where they have been visibly affected by the poems because it relates so clearly to their own lives, and whether that's moments of happiness or sadness, those poems, through Wordsworth being honest, I guess, from his own experience, do speak to people. I think there's a relevance too through climate, through ecological matters, where his whole idea that if we live with nature, if we love nature, if we are at one with nature, then how can we treat the planet as we do? And if more people could see through his writing that by being at one, rather than thinking we control the planet, then surely that will have a relevance and a benefit today as well. And I think through communities too. And when Wordsworth talks about community and the breakup of the Lake District community, well, how different again is that to today? People threatened about their livelihoods, their homes, threatened about family and the people with which they live. And there's a word that I shall end with, which Wordsworth, I just love his use of the word kindness. And it comes up in his great work, The Old Cumberland Beggar. It comes up with, in Tintern Abbey, the idea that if we're kind to each other, we can all be kind. We can be kind. Even the Old Cumberland Beggar can offer kindness, and the people who give him charity also offer kindness. And I think that there is a very gentle, very almost nice word, but a word which could make such a difference to our own lives and to the people that we live with.